When you see this slide in front of you and are horrified, offended, insulted, we're already on the good track. In the beginning of the 19th century, the famous von Clausewitz described interactions within the modern society as three forces: politics, people, and government. In Clausewitz's understanding, it was the army, but today we speak more of the government because army is part of the government. These forces were in equilibrium, and as long as they are in equilibrium, the society develops in the orderly fashion to take care of its business and to attain its intended strategy. When a disaster happens, be it an earthquake, fire, explosion, tsunami, collapsing bank, pandemic, or anything else that costs the society some form of casualties, be it in cost of human lives or economical costs, the government is expected to step in and provide instructions, directions, and mitigate the crisis so that it ends as soon as possible and the society returns back to its normal functions. This is a very complex set of interactions that involve practically all participants who act within the disaster sphere. There are elements of time, there are elements of information management and knowledge management. There is the issue of trust, which is very important. There is the primary issue of purpose on which it all centers. The government must have a purpose of its actions in order to mitigate the disaster. But then this happened. Precisely 3 years ago, COVID pandemic has been declared as a worldwide pandemic. WHO proclaimed that event, and the forces, governmental forces of the government, attempted to interact with their own societies, with their own politics and events that clearly derailed the society as we had known it. Instead of clear directions and directives and information, the governments at the global scale started issuing very odd comments. We were doing everything in order to. Our environmental agencies were doing everything in order to. All resources at our disposal were committed and the water was safe to drink. And we were fully prepared, but unfortunately we're not really prepared. And who was to blame? No, it was the illegal immigrants who were bringing the disease into our shores. It was clearly a conspiracy. And incidentally, the Congressional or Governmental Commission would surely do something in order to prevent further spread. Clearly, within a very short time, it dawned upon us that we did not have St. Augustine descending upon our world and miraculously curing the plague, eliminating its disastrous consequences, and reviving the dead. And in the absence of sainthood, we had to figure out something else. And we truly concentrated on the best thing that we had known throughout centuries, or maybe even millennia. We started looking for scapegoats and how to apportion blame. 3 years after the declaration of COVID as a pandemic, we are still in a fairly agile search for culprits, but more and more we concentrate on one: China. Well, some people say that maybe not quite, we are not quite sure, but on the other hand, in order to be on the safe side, yes, it is China. What we failed to realize, but what has been realized by a famous British economist, Northcote Parkinson, is the fact that the competence of organizations is inversely proportional to organizational complexity. And as it turns out, at the simplest level of our emergency rooms and our intensive care units, organizations were very competent. Organizations were fighting, pretty much losing battle with what they had to encounter due to other problems, but they were very, very competent. At a higher level, the level of hospitals, the situation was a little bit more difficult. There was a question of opening new hospital units, gathering personnel resources, rechanneling financial resources that create chaos in itself. Nonetheless, hospitals coped and coped quite well. At a higher level, at the level of states, provinces, the situation became a little bit confused because these higher instances were distributing directives and orders that were based on two old concepts of fighting pandemic diseases, on prepared plans that pertained to other events, and distributed these directives downstream that did not make life at the level of individual front units easier. The disaster occurred at the level of national command. Very rapidly, those who knew something about the problem were swept aside. The roaring lions were absolutely terrified and substituted by bleating sheep and braying donkeys. That was not quite good, because the simplest common sense method of Swiss cheese were personal responsibilities and shared responsibilities combined in order to mitigate the disaster that was impending and affecting us in the grossest possible manner, turned out not to be possible. What turned out to be possible was a command influence. Our highest command centers, in which donkeys and sheep were running the show, having chased roaring lions away and into hiding, were providing the organizations below them with a stream of directives, guidances, suggestions, orders, conflicting with each other, conflicting among themselves, confusing, pertinently wrong, and making life of the frontline units extremely difficult and, in some situations, downright dangerous. Nurses, first responders, physicians, those who run ICUs and ERs were paying for that confusion with their lives. The problem that truly emerged from all that was generally fairly simple. Were we prepared, which means we were doing what we had already known, or were we ready, which means we knew what we should be doing? In the former case, we would rely on prepositioned plans, and plans that typically stay in nice blue binders on the topmost shelf of our library, gathering dust. Or the brain took over the common sense thinking and was dominant over absolutely everything else. I would like you to pay attention to these two definitions: the difference between preparedness, which is essentially the availability of prepositioning of all resources, both human and physical, that are necessary in order to implement whatever strategy we have in mind, or readiness, which is the ability to act instantaneously and respond to a suddenly occurring, absolutely unexpected, unpremeditated, and unpredictable crisis, and our responses based on immediately available resources that are not prepositions. Whatever we have at hand, we use and then move over to other possible avenues of mitigation. The problem of preparedness has been characterized probably best by a French general who made this statement and who lost his position. The general's been cashiered. And who said, in 1914, we were utterly unprepared. In 1940, we were extremely well prepared for 1914. This is a scathing remark, but we hear it all the time following every major disaster or crisis. We hear it from the highest levels of the government to the leaders of our response teams who say persistently and continuously, this time we were not prepared, but next time, oh sure, we will. What do we do in order to prevent those failures? Clearly, the problem does not reside with the bottom level of our mitigation effort, with those who truly work directly and confront the disaster in front lines, but with our leading institutions, politicians at the very top, our executive leaders who, frankly, do not quite know what they're doing. The only solution to this is to train our executive leaders in crisis, in this particular case, in the case of COVID, biocrisis management. However, in order to train them, you have to get them together, and that's not simple. All those people will immediately come with a series of excuses of not having enough time, of scheduling problems, of knowing what needs to be done, and the proposition of being trained is reaching the level of being absolutely preposterous, if not quite downright offensive. But we can substitute personal presence with what technology offers us, and we can train those people in the metaverse environment. And metaverse in itself is maybe a little bit too optimistic and too complex, but we can do a lot using the technology that is absolutely available to us, and we can create network-centric senior executive high-performing leader teams that, at least in ground theory, should be able to address any kind of crisis, address that crisis competently, mitigate it very efficiently, and return this perturbed society to the proverbial even keel within a rapidly foreseen future. What needs to be done, however, is also convincing executive leaders to respond in the manner that is quite familiar to the military. They have to define the purpose of the activities. There are very many. Let's say if we are dealing with COVID, do we want to eliminate the virus? Do we want to develop a vaccine? Do we want to put people in quarantine? Do we want to make sure that certain groups of the society are protected more than others? Do we want to throw out immigrants? Do we want to pray? Or what is our principal purpose? Because just saying that we want to fight the pandemic is just about as much informative and useful in this context as saying, oh, we want to walk on Mars. Maybe we will sometime in future. In the context of COVID, we lost already 7 million people, and with plans as dilute and lacking precision, we risk losing maybe 20, maybe more. So our actions have to follow an acronym, PERSI, and our executive leaders need to hammer that acronym into their heads and follow it quite slavishly to achieve even moderate success. Now, teams are probably the most popular word in business operations. This is the cornerstone of corporate life, of practically any life. And if you telephone your local butcher and order a piece of meat, the answer will be our team will be sending it to you forthwith. Everybody's operating on the principles of teams without, quite frankly, knowing what teams are. Our executive leaders form teams as well, because our ministers have the secretaries have undersecretaries, undersecretaries have other secretaries and assistants. We have a team. Our goal, in order to attain absolutely anything, is to convert that team into a high-performing team of leaders. And we can achieve that by equipping our teams with, first of all, leader qualities. We are talking a lot about leadership, but quite frankly, nobody really knows what it is. We embed them within the aura, atmosphere, balloon, ecosystem of information and knowledge management and collaborative technology. And by interaction of these methods with the pre-existing team, convert the team into high-performing leader team. However, converting the regular team into a high-performing leader team is not that simple. You see, in medicine, we have a saying of see one, do one, teach one. C1 is simple, and maybe C10. Do one is very complex. You have to practice that one very many times before you truly know what you are doing and before you cease to be a liability or, well, a glorified killer into an expert surgeon. And only then you can teach. The conclusion, unless you train our teams, our already constituted high-performing leader teams, and unless you train them relatively frequently, nothing will happen. The skills will get lost, and we will fall back to the pre-high-performing leader team solution. Literally having a team that is incapable of doing anything. Frequent, repetitive exercises gives us several advantages. First of all, we improve team communication and collaboration. We improved situational understanding, which needs to be very fast in order to be effective. We develop a much higher degree of shared purpose, trust, and through those, team competence and confidence. What we achieve through these different attributes that are honed, trained, practiced, and become almost like spinal reflexes is our ability to attain actionable understanding, which is absolutely critical for development of any mitigation effort that makes sense. This has been already done. The United States government instituted a series of top-off exercises. Top-off stands for top officials, which were very sensible because they involved the topmost layer of officials involved in any kind of disaster response. And it was not only first responders, but it were medical authorities, military authorities, National Guard authorities, everyone, business authorities, everyone who had anything to do with crisis response was involved. The concept was splendid. The execution was complex. The effect and impact, regrettably, equal to practically zero. Why? Because due to very high expense, these exercises were not repeated on a frequent basis, and frequent means every 3 months, or even less. Many of these exercises were not like crises that occur in real life. Unpremeditated, unprepared for, unexpected. The rumors were spreading the participants were pre-warned for what to expect, and therefore the exercise was, like very many other exercises, executed on the basis of knowing what was going to happen and how to respond to it, which simply misses entirely the original purpose of suddenness and lack of preparation. The element of readiness was completely gone, and the participants were prepared. Another aspect of those exercises is very critical, and we enter into yet another sphere of activities that is based on the famous OODA loop. Created by an Air Force colonel, John Boyd, OODA loop is probably the most perfect description of our interactions with any kind of environment, and especially environment that we encounter very suddenly. The first stage of OODA loop is observation. When we enter the unknown environment, we have to observe that environment in order to figure out what it is. How do we mesh with that environment? What is our position within this environment? And once we orient ourselves, once we observe that environment, we move to the next stage, which is the stage of orientation. At that stage, we place ourselves in context of the potential modification of that environment. How will we change it in order to eventually fit our own intentions, prepare a number of actions, and then we move over to the stage of decision-making. We define decisions that we intend to implement, decisions that will definitively shape the environment in the way that definitively suits our strategic or tactical purposes. And finally, we move to the stage of actions, where we enact the decisions that we have already made and follow only these decisions and not anything else. In normal interpretation of the OODA loop, the participants in the exercises stop at that. They enact actions, and that's the end of it. Note, however, that when you act upon an environment, you change it. And when you change, you enter into the next stage of observation. You have to observe how your action changed the environment. Has the environment changed as you wished it to change? Or maybe something, again, unpredicted occurred to which you will have to respond. You have to orient yourself within that new environment, make the new set of decisions, act. And the next stage, once again, changes the environment. In other words, OODA loop has a fractal nature. You don't stop it. You repeat it and repeat it and repeat it because you constantly encounter something new and something that you could not predict right away. Ultimately, upon a series of revolutions of the loop, you will be able to make predictions that are increasingly closer to the reality of purposeful and aim-oriented mitigation. You increase the speed of the loop, which means that you enter within the loop of your enemy, your adversary, and in this case, if it's a disaster, it is the disaster that is your adversary. You interact with it, but you dictate the operational tempo, and you dictate what's going to happen, rather than the environment or your adversary imposing those things upon you. Note that there's a very interesting thing. Teams of leaders, the interactions of teams of leaders, are actually feeding their output into the OODA loop. They feed those input into the stage of orientation and into the stage of decision-making, modifying these stages with new information that is pertinent to what you want to do and how you want to do it. And OODA loop that feeds those things into development of very rapid consolidation of actionable understanding, and that in turn leads to practically immediate crisis intervention. In summary, you end up on a fairly mind-boggling complexity of executive leader teams, high-performing leader teams, that feed their inputs and receive the outputs from knowledge and information management centers, that in turn receive the information from outlying networks of nodes that generate that information. The information is passed through the cloud into the information and knowledge management centers, where it's converted into actionable knowledge. That actionable knowledge is passed over to high-performing executive leader teams, that in turn passes the relevant outputs to field-acting high-performing leader teams that, through interaction among themselves, very rapidly develop actionable understanding and interact with the task at hand, and that is mitigation of crisis. As complex as it seems, and almost confusing, it has been done. It has been done in the context of bioterrorism through virtual reality-based exercises that involved 5 nations across both sides of Atlantic and close to 200 participants. Exercises that were extraordinarily successful, where simulation played cardinal role, and that proved that the concept of high-performing leader teams is, as a matter of fact, very, very valid, and that concept may help to disclose very significant drawbacks in our interactions with unexpected crises. One of the subjects of this exercise was prevention of the spread of smallpox. And to our absolute horror, we realized that close to 65% of physicians and nurses interacting with smallpox could not tell the difference between smallpox and measles. That would lead, if that were truly the case in real life, that would lead to the spread of smallpox with pretty much the same rapidity as that of COVID. That was a very sobering element of that exercise, and it came to the surface only because it was performed using the principles that I have just described to you. Now, you have to understand one thing. Any crisis, be it pandemic or banking crisis or military crisis, is not only this what strikes your eye, let's say in the situation of pandemic, the issues of public health, of facilities available to deal with the people, but many other things. Every crisis affects the society one way or another, more or less directly, but if we do not pay attention to the ramifications, these ramifications will develop into other crises, and all of a sudden, what seemed to be fairly simple but had not been addressed appropriately at the beginning blows up into a massive upheaval that is very, very difficult to deal with, contain, and mitigate. Note that in terms of the pandemic, we have the effects of the pandemic out in the street, in the hospitals and business, in execution of transport and normal societal functions. We are dealing with firewalls that all of a sudden become quite critical because we have to maintain security of our interactions, prevent intrusions that might be very harmful in that context. We need to use modern technology It is nothing but the entrance into the Internet of networks and Internet of things. Everything interacts with each other, and the output is informational overload. The deeper we go into it, the more affected are our own neural works, the less sense we make out of everything. Everything is new, everything is frightening, and we simply lose the possibility of interacting with critical elements because everything seems, at least on the surface of things, as being critical. The advent of artificial intelligence, as imperfect as artificial intelligence is today, is very helpful. It helps us to make sense of things that hitherto were not making sense and hitherto were rejected, and confusion that very frequently hid very critical elements that were of crucial importance for interacting with the crisis, but because of chaos, informational chaos, were completely bypassed or not even noticed. Interaction of human and artificial intelligence helps us to achieve two very significant stages. One is traceability of our actions. We know what happens, what happened, what, where, when, how. We know how to combine disparate methods of interactions, and all these actions are transparent. Those who interact with the crisis know what happens, how connections develop, what, where, and when they develop, how are they generated, and what other attributes affect the connections that hitherto were entirely unprepared for or totally unaware of. There's one problem to it. As you can see, any major human center generates huge amount of data. These are networks that are very active, where participants within the network interact with each other incessantly, generate massive amount of information, and at the level of a country as large as the United States, we are producing data at the rate of brontobytes. It's the amount that is hardly imaginable. The data that contain very pertinent information that can be transformed into extraordinarily pertinent knowledge that is critical for dealing with the crisis at hand, and that we are missing. The fundamental aspect of dealing with such magnificent amount of information that is circulating within the interacting circles is active telecommunications. Telecommunication systems are very frequently jammed by excessive amount of data inputs. It can be transformed, or maybe it has been succinctly said by General Russell Honore when talking to the governor of Louisiana. Governor, if you can use your cell phone, you don't have a disaster. You have an inconvenience. That's the problem. We have a disaster because we cannot pass information that is needed to the places where it is needed at the speed that assures that that information reaches its target at the time when it is needed. We need to have very robust telecommunication systems, any which telecommunication systems. Anything that can be used needs to be employed in parallel, in series, substitute for one thing for another. It has to work. And we must find out how to make our telecommunication systems work, because the inputs of data are highly disparate, frequently disconnected, very often superficially irrelevant, and yet their relevance becomes very apparent once they go through highly sophisticated analytic processes. We cannot risk losing anything because telecommunications collapse on us. Hitherto, we were doing things accordingly to the ancient proscript by the French marshal of the early 18th century, Maurice de Saxe, who said that when generals come to the front, they do what they know, and followed the statement by they should know, or they have to know what they should be doing. And we can add to that and how. And now, in order to terminate this discourse, there's a question. Is creation equal to destruction? You might have noticed that readiness may involve destruction of concepts upon which we have based our preparedness. But how? And in order to give you a practical example of this, I will use the example frequently used by Colonel Boyd, the creator of the OODA loop. You are presented with 5 different objects: a tank, a bicycle, a boat, an engine, and a set of skis. Your task is to create something that can be used in a crisis during the winter, something that is very, very useful. And you have 30 seconds to invent that thing, starting from now. I don't see any answers yet. Time is running. Time is running very rapidly. We are just about to run out of time. The time is over. And this is the answer. You see, you have destroyed 5 different objects, took useful things out of it, took the engine, took the tracks, took the skis, took the handlebar, took the hull, and you have created the snowmobile. And a snowmobile is extremely useful for distribution of information, distribution of resources such as medical resources, food, water, shelter, whatever, during winter. Running across snow-covered fields, running across adverse weather, the snowmobile is one of those life-saving instruments. And that's the essence of rapid response, of readiness. You respond to the crisis with whatever you have, and you create new tools, new approaches, without paying much attention to what has been prepared before. Sooner or later, you will reach there, but your first 24 hours may make the difference between success and failure. Thank you.